the number one thing you can do to increase the equity and representation of students you identify is to use universal screening. And I talk about universal screening in contrast to referral-led screening. So if your process starts with the teacher or parent referring the student for testing, then you're using something like nomination first. Universal screening is any time that you give some kind of objective assessment to all students to give them an opportunity to place. Most of the time, once that first step is accomplished, we have something like either a confirmation test or a holistic review of multiple ratings or scores or information about the student. And then finally, that would lead to some kind of identification or determination of services. So what counts as referral? Like I said, teacher nomination, teacher rating forms, especially if they're not behaviorally anchored, so it's kind of, how much do I think these students are gifted? We use a rating form in Alabama that's not behaviorally anchored, and so it's very influenced by the same kinds of implicit bias that nomination is influenced by. And then any kind of rating of student products is not really driven by a rubric. What counts as universal screener is any kind of objective assessment that's related to the services offered. So pros and cons. So for referral-led identification, obviously it's popular because it's quick and cost-effective. It requires fewer resources for testing because you just don't have to test as many students. You only test those referred. And this is very popular. The State of the States annual survey showed that 86% of districts use some form of teacher nomination and identification. So if you're using this, you're certainly not alone. But the downside of these approaches is that teacher ratings are found to be biased towards overrepresented groups. So that implicit bias, I don't think there's any teacher out there doing this on purpose, but just the way that we're socialized, we tend to over-identify white, high SES, and boys for gifted programming. And then parent referrals are, of course, influenced by all the same influences, as well as cultural capital, so knowing the value of being referred for gifted programming. So in thinking about screening-led identification, it's not perfect, but it does give all students similar opportunities to place into the program. It's important that all students have equal practice and opportunity to learn about the test prior to testing. It reduces the potential for implicit bias, and it eliminates some of the stereotypes about giftedness that influence the referral process. The downsides, it requires time and testing, and that's a big deal for a lot of schools. A lot of districts find that too intensive, and it requires more resources if you do the universal screening and then you want some kind of confirmation test that requires additional testing time. Now, one of the things I recommend, and we had another webinar on this, is if you use COGAT, or something like COGAT, for differentiating instruction in the regular classroom, it can be easier to promote or to convince other people to invest the kind of resources that you need for universal screening, because it provides benefits to the regular classroom teacher and to all students, as opposed to testing that's just for gifted identification. So that can be a way to pitch universal screening in your school. So does this actually give us any benefits? And actually we have some data from a large district in Florida that moved from a referral-led process to a universal screening process. So we basically have a natural experiment where they looked at what the influence of universal screening was on student identification. And what they found was that universal screening did increase equity. It did increase the representation of students in gifted programs. So you see that overall, it increased, it doubled the number of students identified in general, which can be a good thing. It can also overload programs. But you also see that it did increase the number of white students because it increased all students, but it greatly increased the number of Black and Hispanic students who were identified for gifted programming. And they did have kind of a process of screening and then confirmation test. So there were some influences there on who ultimately was placed in gifted and talented. But the big shift from referral to universal screening had these huge impacts of tripling the number of students identified. So another thing that you can do that influences the diversity of students who are identified is looking at how you combine different test scores. So these are three representations of how you can combine. So if you have something like COGAT with 3 test batteries and 3 test scores available, or if you look at multiple different indicators, like you have achievement and ability tests, or you have teacher ratings and ability, there are different ways of combining those that can have impacts on both the size of the program and the diversity of the students that you get. So the first method would be the AND rule. And if you use the AND rule, that means that students have to have high scores on both Test 1 and Test 2 to place into the program. So you can see that it makes the smallest number of students identified, and you'll have students who have really high scores on Test 1 or Test 2 that aren't being served because they don't have high scores on both. The average rule is when you take the mathematical average of the scores. So you don't get all the students with high scores on each of the tests, but you do get more students in general, and it's basically compensatory. Like, you can do a little worse on one test as long as you have very high scores on the other test. So that's the average rule. It gets kind of in between numbers of students. And then finally, the OR rule says if you get a high score on any of the tests, you're identified, or you pass on to the next stage or whatever you have. And you see that this identifies any student with a high score on either test. This is the largest number of students identified, but importantly, you'll have students who score high on one test who have very low scores on the other test. So you have a very broad range of abilities in this group of students, but you don't miss anyone who has a high score in one of the areas that you're assessing. So we looked at some COGAT data to see kind of what the impact of these combination scores were on identification. And you can see that there's a huge impact on the number of students identified, almost an order of magnitude. Almost 6,000 students identified under the OR rule, and only 600 identified under the AND rule. And this is using the 3 COGAT batteries. So the AND rule meant you had to have a high score on verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal. The average is more like the composite score, where you can offset a low score in one area with a high score in another. So you can see that average identified kind of a medium number of students. But the important part is the diversity. So when you look at the number of students, or the proportion of students, we compared it to their proportion in the total sample of about 36,000. So the purple bars are their representation in the full sample. When you use the OR rule, and so you identified a very large number of students, you got the closest representation. So you still didn't get full representation, but you did get a better representation of each group of students. You can look at I have the complete paper if you'd like to see all the analyses. When you control for the size of the program, you don't get the big effects of diversity, but you do have the opportunity here to, if you identify more and serve more, you will have a greater number of underrepresented groups in your program. And that's important to think about, because the services you offer to a group that's identified on the OR have to be very different, because again, you'll have some students, let's say this is a verbal and a quantitative reasoning test, you'll have some students with very strong quantitative skills who do not have strong verbal skills, as opposed to here with the AND rule, they will all have high scores in everything, but you get a very homogeneous and small group of students compared to the OR rule. So there's a lot of trade-offs, but it's something to consider. It's not just a decision to be made lightly. It has important implications for both the number of students and diversity of students you'll serve.